Imagine saving up your entire life to purchase your absolute dream home. You work hard, you make sacrifices, and you finally find a beautiful, historic, 6-bedroom mansion in one of the most affluent, peaceful neighborhoods in the entire country. You sign the papers, you get the keys, and you are getting ready to move your young children into this perfect new space. But then, just 3 days after the sale is finalized, before you have even spent a single night in the house, you walk out to the mailbox and find a letter. And this letter is not a friendly welcome from a neighbor. It is a deeply disturbing, anonymous message from someone who claims to have been watching the house for decades, who knows exactly what kind of car you drive, and who is actively counting your children, promising to call to them and take them from you. This is not a horror movie. This is the real-life nightmare that a family went through, and it is a case that remains completely unsolved to this day. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Bratis purchased their dream home. It was a beautiful, classic $1.3 million 6-bedroom house located at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. Now, Westfield is a very wealthy, peaceful town in northern New Jersey, and at the time, Boulevard was considered the absolute street to live on. If you owned a home on Boulevard, it meant you had truly made it. It was a symbol of ultimate success and luxury. Derek and Maria knew this, and they felt incredibly lucky and proud to have secured this beautiful property for their family. Just 3 days after they purchased the house, the Bratis family had not actually moved in yet. They were still living at their old home while they waited for some minor renovations and painting to be completed. Derek had gone over to 657 Boulevard alone on a warm summer evening to do some painting on the walls. He was just so excited about the house that he wanted to be in the space, work on it with his own hands, and imagine his kids running through the hallways. His wife, Maria, and their 3 young children were back at their old home. As Derek was working, he decided to take a break and go check the mail. He knew they had only owned the property for 3 days, but he wanted to experience the simple, satisfying routine of collecting the mail at his brand new home. He walked down the front steps, opened the mailbox, and found a small card-shaped envelope addressed simply to the new owners. He tore it open, expecting a welcoming card from a neighbor or perhaps some junk mail. Instead, he found a typed letter that would completely change the course of his life. The letter began with a welcoming tone that quickly turned into something deeply ominous. It read, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here?" "I will find out." Derek's heart began to race as he read those words, but the letter got progressively worse. The writer went on to identify the exact make and model of the car the Bratis family drove, which was a Honda minivan. The letter also noted how many contractors had been working in and around the house over the past couple of days. But the most horrifying part of the letter was a direct threat aimed at Derek's 3 young children. The writer wrote, "I believe I have counted that you have 3 children. Someday I will learn their names and I will call to them and I will take them from you." Derek was absolutely frozen with fear. He realized that this was not a joke. Someone had been sitting nearby, closely watching his family, counting his children, and tracking their movements from the very moment they bought the house. He ran back inside, shut all the windows, locked all the doors, turned off the lights, and fled the property. He drove straight back to his old home, where his wife and kids were, and they immediately called the police. When the police arrived, they read the letter and were completely baffled. The language inside the letter was highly unusual, written in a strange, formal style that felt almost archaic, yet deeply stalkerish and threatening. The police had no idea who could have written it, and they asked Derek if he had any known enemies, but he was just a regular, hard-working family man with no conflicts. The letter had no return address and was signed simply, "The Watcher." That night, after the police left, Derek and Maria were completely on edge. Despite how late it was, they decided to send an email to the Woods family, who were the previous owners who had just sold them the house. They explained what had happened and asked if they had ever received any weird or threatening letters during their time at 657 Boulevard. The Woods family wrote back and admitted that just 3 days before they officially closed on the sale and handed over the keys, they had received a letter from someone calling themselves the Watcher. But they said the letter was not threatening at all. It was actually thanking them for taking such good care of the house during their time there and stating that the writer would continue to look after the property. The Woods family told Derek that they did not think much of it at the time, so they simply crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. This news made Derek and Maria even more terrified. They realized that this stalker was actively monitoring the property and knew the exact moment the house was being sold to a new family. They decided that they were absolutely not going to move their children into the house yet. Instead, They would keep living in their old home and only make day trips to 657 Boulevard to supervise the contractors and work on the renovations, hoping that the police would catch the person or that the stalker would simply lose interest. But about 2 weeks after the first letter was found, Maria was at the new house with the kids. She walked out to the mailbox and saw another small envelope with the exact same handwriting. She did not even open it. She immediately called the police, and when they arrived, they opened the second letter together. This second letter was even more detailed and terrifying than the first. It read, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carloads of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will." The letter then went on to identify each of their 3 children by their specific nicknames and in their exact birth order. This detail made Maria's blood run cold. It is one thing for a stalker to look up public records and find the names of the buyers and their children, but to know their personal, intimate nicknames meant that the watcher had to have been standing close enough to the family to overhear them speaking to each other. This person was not just watching from across the street with binoculars. They were practically standing right next to them, blending into the background, listening to their private conversations. The letter got even creepier. The watcher asked about one of the daughters, writing, "Is she going to be an artist? I saw her using her easel yesterday." This was a massive revelation because the easel the little girl had been using was set up in a specific back room of the house that was almost completely obscured from the street by thick trees and heavy shrubbery. There was really only one very specific vantage point on the entire property where you could actually see into that room and spot the child painting. To see her, the watcher would have had to be standing directly on the property, hidden in the bushes, right outside the window. And they did this while the family and the contractors were actively on high alert. The letter ended with a chilling threat that made it impossible for Derek and Maria to ever consider letting their kids sleep in that house. The writer asked, "Do your kids go in the basement? I would be afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house, and if you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I will know as soon as you move in, then I can plan better." At this point, Derek and Maria were in full crisis mode. This was no longer just a creepy nuisance. It was an active, direct threat against the lives of their children. They decided to halt all plans to move into the house. Weeks went by and they did not go to the property at all. Then, a third letter arrived. It simply said, "Where are you? The house misses you." During the early stages of the investigation, Derek was speaking with a neighbor named John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from 657 Boulevard. John suggested that Derek should look into the Langford family, who lived right next door to the new house. The Langfords were a bit of an unusual family. The household consisted of a mother in her 90s and her adult children who were in their 60s. One of the sons, Michael Langford, was known in the neighborhood as being a highly eccentric, strange individual. Neighbors said it was not uncommon to see him walking across people's yards, looking into windows, and just making people feel incredibly uncomfortable. Derek brought this up to the police, but they told him that they had already questioned Michael Langford. He completely denied any involvement, and they had absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the letters. Later in the investigation, forensic analysts managed to extract a trace amount of DNA from under the seal of one of the envelopes, and they discovered that it belonged to a female. This ruled out Michael Langford. The police then turned their attention to the Langford's daughter, but after testing her DNA from a discarded water bottle, they found it was not a match. The Langford family was completely ruled out. Derek was growing increasingly paranoid, angry, and obsessive. He was furious that some anonymous coward was keeping his family from their dream home and threatening his children. He began spending his nights alone in the dark, empty house, sitting silently behind the windows and staring out at the mailbox, hoping to catch anyone who approached it. He spent thousands of dollars installing an elaborate camera system and hired 2 retired FBI agents to launch a private investigation. He even hired a handwriting expert who analyzed the letters and concluded that the writer was someone possessed by an extraordinary amount of anger, but they could not identify who it was. Eventually, the Braddis family ran into a major financial crisis. They had already sold their old home, and the new owners of that house were ready to move in. Since they could not safely move into 657 Boulevard, Derek, Maria, and their kids had to move into Maria's parents' house, crowding into a small space. All the while, they were still paying a massive monthly mortgage on 657 Boulevard, a beautiful, empty mansion that they could not live in. Rumors started spreading like wildfire in the wealthy town of Westfield. People noticed the beautiful home was sitting vacant, and assumed Derek and Maria were getting a divorce or had run into massive legal trouble. The Braddis family gradually became pariahs in the community. Desperate to escape the financial drain, they decided to put the house back on the market. But by this time, the rumors about the property had become so widespread that nobody wanted to buy it. They lowered the price repeatedly, facing a massive financial deficit, but still, no one made an offer. Out of frustration, Derek and Maria filed a lawsuit against the previous owners, the Woods family, claiming they should have disclosed the letter they received before the closing of the sale. They hoped the lawsuit would remain quiet, but a local reporter picked up the story, and within days, it became a massive international news sensation. The Bradis family was flooded with over 300 media requests. News vans and curious tourists were parked outside the house 24 hours a day, forcing the family to completely flee the town of Westfield to escape the pressure. Years went by, and the house continued to sit empty. Finally, they got a small break when a family agreed to rent the house from them. The rent money did not even cover the monthly mortgage, but it was better than nothing. Derek and Maria wrote a clause into the contract explaining the history of the Watcher and stating that if the renters ever received a letter, they could immediately break the lease without penalty. The renters moved in, but just 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived in the mailbox. It was addressed to the renters, but it was clearly aimed at the Bradis family. It read, "You wonder who the Watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me." One of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. My soldiers at the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission, and they saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher. The renters were deeply spooked, but they agreed to stay as long as Derek installed even more security cameras, which he did immediately. They took the letter to the police, but once again, the investigation went nowhere. Finally, in 2019, unable to bear the emotional and financial toll any longer, the Bradis family sold 657 Boulevard for a staggering $400,000 loss. They were just so desperate to rid themselves of the house that they were willing to take a massive financial hit just to walk away. But right before they officially closed the sale, they received one final, mocking letter from their tormentor. It simply said, "You were despised by the house, and the Watcher won." To this day, the identity of the Watcher remains one of the most baffling, frustrating unsolved mysteries in modern history. Many neighbors believe Derek wrote the letters himself to get out of the home purchase, but the devastating financial and emotional toll on his family makes this theory highly unlikely. The mystery remains completely unsolved, and the true identity of the person who claimed to own the soul of 657 Boulevard may never be known. Now, we are going to transition to our second story, which is perhaps one of the most famous and heavily discussed disappearances in the history of the internet. It is a case that has puzzled investigators, medical professionals, and millions of viewers worldwide because of a highly disturbing piece of video evidence captured on multiple airport security cameras. This is the story of a 28-year-old German man named Lars Mittank. On June 30th, 2014, Lars Mittank and 4 of his closest friends left their homes in northern Germany to take a week-long vacation to Bulgaria. They were staying at a very popular seaside resort area called the Golden Sands, which is famous for its beautiful beaches and vibrant nightlife. For the first several days, everything was absolutely perfect. They spent their time relaxing on the beach, swimming, eating great food, and going to the local clubs. But as the trip was nearing its end on the night of July 6th, things took a sudden and dramatic turn. Lars and his friends went to a local sports bar to watch a soccer game. Lars was a passionate fan of a specific team, and during the match, he began vocally expressing his support. However, there was a group of local men in the bar who supported the opposing team, and what started as sports banter quickly escalated into a tense verbal confrontation. Lars's friends stepped in, grabbed Lars, and pulled him out of the bar before a fight could break out. Later that night, around midnight, the group decided to stop at a local McDonald's to get some food. Lars told his friends that he was not hungry and would wait outside while they went in to order. But when his friends finished ordering and walked back outside, Lars was nowhere to be found. They waited for a while, then went back to the hotel, assuming he had walked back on his own to get some sleep. But his room was completely empty. Lars's friends went to bed, and when they woke up the next morning, they were relieved to find that Lars had returned. But their relief turned to deep concern when they saw him. He looked disheveled, and he claimed that after his friends went into the McDonald's, he was suddenly approached and brutally beaten by a group of Russian or Bulgarian men who he believed were hired by the people he had argued with in the sports bar earlier that night. His friends found the story hard to believe because they had only been inside the McDonald's for a short time and had heard no commotion outside, but since they were scheduled to fly back to Germany that day, they focused on getting him home safely. Lars complained that his ear was hurting badly from where he had been struck during the scuffle, and his friends urged him to see a doctor before their flight. Lars went to a medical clinic near the resort, where the doctor examined his ear and discovered that Lars had suffered a severely perforated eardrum. The doctor recommended immediate surgery, which Lars refused, stating he would rather wait until he got back to Germany. The doctor then prescribed him an antibiotic called cefuroxime, but warned Lars that because of the air pressure changes that occur during a flight, flying with a perforated eardrum could be extremely dangerous and could lead to permanent hearing loss or severe infection. The doctor advised Lars not to fly that night and to stay in Bulgaria for a few more days to allow his ear to heal. Lars went back and told his friends what the doctor had said. His friends immediately offered to stay behind with him, but Lars insisted they go home, stating he would simply find a cheap hotel near the airport, rest for a couple of days, and then buy a new ticket. His friends boarded their flight back to Germany, leaving Lars completely alone in Bulgaria. Lars took a taxi and checked into a budget establishment called the Hotel Color, which was located in a rough, sketchy neighborhood near the airport. This is where his behavior began to spiral into complete paranoia. Around midnight, Lars made a frantic phone call to his mother, Sandra Mittank, back in Germany, telling her that she needed to immediately call his bank and completely shut off all of his credit and debit cards. Sandra was confused, but Lars refused to explain why and abruptly hung up. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Lars called his mother back. This time, he was whispering, and his voice was trembling with absolute terror. Sandra would later state that she could tell through the phone that her son was in genuine, paralyzing fear for his life. Lars whispered, "Mother, you have to help me. There is a group of men trying to attack me. They are tracking me right now, and they are going to kill me." He then hung up. Shortly after, he sent her a text message asking about the antibiotic cefuroxime, sounding deeply suspicious that the medicine was actually something dangerous. What Lars did not know was that the security cameras inside the Hotel Color were capturing his every move. When investigators later reviewed the footage, they saw Lars pacing up and down the hotel hallways, looking incredibly paranoid and constantly looking over his shoulder. At one point, the footage showed him stepping into an elevator and suddenly crouching down to hide in the corner, as if he believed someone was about to shoot at him through the doors. The hotel staff also noted that Lars left the hotel completely for about an hour in the middle of the night, wandering out into the dark, dangerous neighborhood before returning to his room. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Lars checked out of the hotel and got into a taxi to go to the airport. There was another passenger riding in the taxi with Lars, and when investigators later interviewed this person, they described Lars's appearance as highly alarming. They said he was completely silent, staring straight ahead, and that his pupils were incredibly dilated, a medical condition known as mydriasis, which can be caused by extreme adrenaline, head trauma, or drug use. Lars arrived at the Varna airport terminal and sent a text to his mother, letting her know he had made it safely. Sandra had booked his flight home, and she suggested that before he boards the plane, he should go to the airport medical clinic and have the doctor examine his ear one last time. Lars followed her advice and walked into the airport doctor's office. The doctor would later recount their interaction, stating that Lars was initially polite but incredibly nervous, his eyes darting around the room, and he seemed deeply suspicious of his surroundings. While the examination was wrapping up, a construction worker wearing a bright reflective safety vest walked into the office to ask a quick question. The moment Lars saw the man in the safety vest, something in his mind completely snapped. He suddenly jumped up from his chair, screaming at the top of his lungs, "I do not want to die. I do not want to die." He dropped his wallet, his passport, his cell phone, and all of his luggage right there on the floor, bolted out of the door, and sprinted into the main terminal. The airport security cameras captured the terrifying scene as Lars ran at full speed through the crowded terminal, weaved between travelers, and burst through the exit doors into the parking lot. He jogged across the asphalt, his eyes wide with terror, constantly looking behind him. He reached the outer edge of the airport property, which was bordered by a massive 8-foot-tall metal fence topped with sharp barbed wire. Without pausing, Lars scrambled up the fence, threw himself over the top, and ran into a thick, dense pine forest that bordered the airport. Lars Mittank disappeared into those woods, and he has never been seen again since that fateful morning on July 7th, 2014. There has been only one unconfirmed sighting of Lars by a truck driver who reported picking up a young, barefoot, disheveled man walking along a highway in Germany a year later, but police were never able to verify this lead. Aside from that, Lars Mittank has completely vanished from the face of the earth. Over the years, several theories have emerged to try to explain his bizarre behavior and sudden disappearance. The first theory points to the antibiotic cefuroxime, wondering if Lars experienced a rare, severe psychotic reaction to the medication, but investigators found the prescription in his abandoned belongings, meaning he had never actually filled or taken the medicine. The second theory is that Lars suffered a traumatic brain injury during the scuffle outside the McDonald's, resulting in a severe concussion that caused sudden, extreme paranoia, though it is rare for a concussion to manifest as a prolonged, highly organized state of paranoid delusion. The third, and most widely accepted theory, is that Lars experienced a sudden, severe onset of schizophrenia or a drug-induced psychotic break triggered by the high stress of the altercation and being alone in a foreign country. The Mittank family refused to give up hope, hiring private investigators and launching massive search campaigns in the Bulgarian forests, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of a body, no clothing, and no campfire ashes. Lars ran into the forest and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a mystery that remains one of the most haunting in the world. Now we are going to transition to our third case, which is a story of survival that is so unbelievable and intensely dramatic that it feels like the plot of a Hollywood thriller. This is the harrowing case of a 13-year-old girl named Jayme Closs from Barron County, Wisconsin. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is the complete lack of a conventional motive. The monster who destroyed Jayme's family was a completely ordinary, quiet 21-year-old man named Jake Patterson who had absolutely no criminal record and no connection to Jayme or her family. In the autumn of 2018, Jake Patterson was on his way to work for only his third day at a local cheese factory in rural Wisconsin. As he was driving his Ford Taurus down a quiet country road, he came to a stop behind a school bus with its red lights flashing, where middle school children were waiting to climb aboard. As he sat there, his eyes locked onto a 13-year-old girl with bright blonde hair and striking green eyes. Her name was Jayme Closs. Jake had never seen this girl before in his life, but as he sat there watching her, a dark conviction took hold of his mind. In his later confession to the police, Jake would state that at that exact moment, he looked at Jayme and thought, "That is the girl I am going to take." From that second on, Jake began meticulously planning a highly complex, violent abduction. He put an extraordinary amount of thought into how he would carry out the crime and avoid leaving any forensic evidence behind. He stole a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun from his father's house, choosing it because it was one of the most common shotguns in America, making it incredibly difficult to trace. He purchased a heavy black balaclava mask from Walmart and completely shaved his head and facial hair to prevent leaving any hair at the crime scene. He bought heavy gloves and carefully wiped down every single shotgun shell with rubbing alcohol to remove his fingerprints and DNA. He made modifications to his car using wire cutters to physically clip the trunk release cable so that the trunk could only be opened from the outside with his key, preventing Jayme from escaping if she found the safety release. He also disconnected the dome light inside the cabin of his car so that when he opened the doors in the dark, no light would turn on to reveal his face to any potential witnesses. 2 separate times, Jake drove to the Closs family home in the middle of the night, intending to break in and kidnap Jayme, but both times he got spooked by cars in the driveway or lights turning on and fled. But on the night of October 15, 2018, he returned for a third time. It was around midnight when the dark Ford Taurus slowly rolled up the driveway of the Closs family home with its headlights turned completely off. Inside the house, 13-year-old Jayme was fast asleep in her bed with her dog Molly curled up next to her. Suddenly, Molly heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway and began barking loudly, waking Jayme. Startled, Jayme looked out the window and saw a strange car parked in the driveway. Terrified, Jayme ran down the hallway to her parents' bedroom and woke them up. Her father, James, immediately got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward the front door. Her mother, Denise, grabbed Jayme and rushed into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. In a desperate bid to protect her daughter, Denise pushed a heavy wooden dresser in front of the door, barricading them inside, and pulled Jayme into the bathtub, wrapping her arms tightly around her. James Closs stood at the front door, looking through the glass window, and saw a masked figure carrying a shotgun walking calmly up the steps. James, thinking this might be a police officer, shone his flashlight through the glass and called out, "Show me your badge." Instead of answering, Jake Patterson raised the shotgun, aimed it directly at the window, and pulled the trigger. The heavy slug shattered the glass, striking James in the chest and killing him instantly. In the bathroom, Jayme heard the deafening roar of the shotgun blast and knew her father was dead. Denise, paralyzed with fear, pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. Leaving the line open so the dispatcher could hear what was happening, Jake Patterson stood at the front door, loaded a fresh slug, aimed the barrel at the door lock, and fired, shattering the lock so the door swung wide open. He stepped over the body of James Closs and began walking slowly through the dark, quiet house. He checked the bedrooms, then walked over to the closed bathroom door and tried to turn the knob, but the heavy dresser prevented it from opening. Jake began slamming his heavy steel-toed boots and his shoulder against the door. After 10 to 15 violent blows, the wooden door began to splinter and crack. Jake reached his hand through the broken top half of the door, pushed the dresser aside, and forced his way into the bathroom. He walked over to the bathtub and violently ripped down the shower curtain, revealing Denise desperately holding on to her terrified daughter. Jake pulled out a roll of heavy duct tape, tossed it to Denise, and commanded her to tape her daughter's mouth shut and bind her hands. Denise defiantly threw the tape aside and pulled Jayme even closer to her chest. Jake set his shotgun down, violently pushed Denise out of the way, and pinned Jayme down, wrapping the duct tape tightly around her mouth, wrists, and ankles. Once Jayme was secured, Jake picked up his shotgun, aimed it directly at Denise Closs's head, turned his face away, and pulled the trigger, killing her. He then picked up the bound, terrified 13-year-old girl, carried her out of the house, tossed her into the cold trunk of his Ford Taurus, slammed the trunk shut, and drove away. The entire attack took a total of just 4 minutes. As Jake was driving away about 20 seconds after leaving the house, he saw a fleet of police cars with their sirens screaming speeding down the road toward the Closs home, but they were just a minute too late. Jake calmly yielded to the police cruisers, blending in as an ordinary driver, and watched them pass him by in his rearview mirror. He drove for nearly 70 miles deep into the remote, heavily wooded areas of northern Wisconsin, eventually arriving at his secluded cabin. When they got inside, Jake cut the duct tape off Jayme, burned her clothes, his gloves, and the used duct tape in his fireplace and gave her a pair of pajamas to put on. He then forced her to crawl under a twin-size bed and began placing heavy objects, including heavy plastic storage bins, metal weights, and a heavy dresser, against the open sides, completely barricading her in. Jake looked under the bed at the terrified, grieving girl and told her that he was keeping his loaded shotgun right next to his chair, warning her that if she made a single sound, tried to move the barricade, or attempted to escape, he would find her and kill her. Because Jayme had just witnessed this man brutally murder both of her parents, she knew with absolute certainty that he was capable of carrying out his threat, so she lay perfectly still. For the next 87 days, Jayme Closs was kept as a prisoner under that bed. Her captivity was defined by physical confinement and psychological abuse, with Jake forcing her to stay under the bed for 10, 12, or even 14 hours at a time without any food, water, or restroom breaks. Meanwhile, a massive nationwide search was underway, with Jayme's face on every television screen and billboard across America, but because Jake had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to the family, his name never appeared on the police's radar. As the weeks went by, Jake grew incredibly confident that he had committed the perfect crime. He began to relax his guard, even having friends and family members over to his cabin to hang out and drink beer, warning Jayme that if she made a single sound, he would kill her and everyone in the house. Jayme lay there, just inches away from people who could have saved her, too terrified to make a sound. But after nearly 3 months of living in this dark, dusty hell, Jayme reached a breaking point and decided that she was either going to escape or die trying. On the morning of January 10th, 2019, Jake Patterson left the cabin to attend a job interview. The moment Jayme heard his car engine fade into the distance, she pressed her back against the wooden bed frame and pushed with her legs against the heavy plastic bins and weights. With a loud scrape, the heavy barricade shifted, and Jayme squeezed her body through the small gap, sliding out from under the bed. She ran to the window, pushed it open, and climbed out into the freezing Wisconsin winter. She did not have a coat or gloves, and the only shoes she could find were Jake's massive steel-toed boots, which she accidentally put on the wrong feet just to keep them snug. Jayme began running down the snowy, deserted road, shivering violently in her pajamas, completely unaware of where she was. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, a local woman named Jeannie Nutter was out walking her dog along the quiet, snow-covered road and noticed a young girl shivering, with no winter gear and wearing massive boots on the wrong feet. Jeannie rushed up to her, and before she could even ask what was wrong, the young girl looked up at her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "My name is Jayme Closs. I do not know where I am. I need help." Jeannie Nutter immediately wrapped her arms around the freezing girl, holding her tight, and said, "I know who you are. You are safe now. I am going to take care of you." Jeannie grabbed Jayme's hand and rushed to the nearest house, which belonged to a couple named Peter and Kristen Kacinskas. They banged on the door, and when Peter opened it, Jeannie cried out, "This is Jayme Closs. We need to call the police right now." They pulled Jayme inside, wrapped her in a warm blanket, and Peter went to his gun safe, pulled out his shotgun, and stood guard at the front door while Jeannie called 911. Within minutes, a massive convoy of police cars arrived at the home, and Jayme was rushed to the hospital. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Jake Patterson had returned from his job interview, discovered Jayme was gone, and got into his Ford Taurus to drive down the road, hoping to find her. But as he was driving, he was pulled over by a police officer who had just received the description of the suspect's vehicle. Jake did not resist, stepping out of the car and saying, "I did it. I know what this is about." Jake Patterson was arrested, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 1 count of kidnapping, and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the ability for parole. While the town celebrated Jayme's miraculous return, the emotional scars left on this brave young girl will take a lifetime to heal, all because a quiet man with no criminal history stopped behind a school bus and decided, on a whim, that she was the one he was going to take. Now, we are going to transition to our 4th and final case, which is a deeply haunting, incredibly controversial mystery that has captivated the true crime community for a decade. This is the tragic and deeply baffling disappearance of 2 young Dutch college students, Kremers and Lisanne, who vanished into the dense, unforgiving jungles of Panama in 2014. To understand the sheer scale of this mystery, you have to look at the incredibly strange, almost paranormal digital evidence that was left behind on their phones and their camera. It is a puzzle where the pieces simply do not fit together, leaving investigators and family members with a deep, lingering sense of horror. In the spring of 2014, 21-year-old Kris Kremers and 22-year-old Lisanne were 2 bright, highly intelligent, and ambitious young women from the Netherlands. They were best friends, roommates, and they shared a deep passion for travel and community service. They had spent the previous 6 months working long hours at a local cafe, saving every single penny they earned to finance a dream trip to Panama. This was not going to be just a simple beach vacation. The girls had meticulously planned a 6-week trip where they would split their time between exploring the beautiful landscape of Panama and volunteering for local charities, teaching English to underprivileged children in rural villages. On March 15, 2014, the two girls arrived in Panama. For the first 2 weeks, their trip was an absolute dream. They traveled to different towns, worked with local organizations, and sent constant happy text messages and emails to their parents back in the Netherlands. They were having the time of their lives. By the end of March, they arrived in a small, picturesque mountain town called Bouquet, which is nestled in a lush, green valley near the border of Costa Rica. They checked into a local hostel, which is a popular low-cost group lodging setup where travelers share dorm rooms. On the morning of April 1st, 2014, Kris and Lee decided to go on a hike. They wanted to tackle a famous trail called El Pianista, which winds up the slopes of the massive, active Baru volcano. The trail leads to a spectacular overlook high above the clouds, offering a breathtaking 360-degree view of the surrounding valleys and jungles. The girls were active and healthy, but they were not highly experienced wilderness survivalists. The El Pianista Trail is beautiful, but it is notoriously difficult, and tourists are strongly advised to hire a local guide, as the trail quickly dissolves into a maze of dense, unmarked jungle paths once you pass the main overlook. Kris and Lee decided to go without a guide. They dressed in light summer clothes, shorts, and tank tops. They packed a single blue backpack containing a water bottle, some cash, their cell phones, and a high-end Canon digital camera. Before they headed out, they spoke with the owner of the hostel, who had a friendly, medium-sized dog. The girls decided to bring the dog along with them for company on the hike. The security cameras and their own digital camera captured the beginning of their journey. They took several beautiful, smiling photos as they began their walk up the sunny trail. Everything seemed completely normal. But that evening, the hostel owner's dog returned to the hostel alone. There was no sign of Kris or Lee. The hostel owners were slightly concerned, but they figured the girls had simply decided to stay in town late to grab some dinner, so they went to bed. But when the girls did not return the next morning, and their beds remained unslept in, the owners realized something was terribly wrong. At the same time, back in the Netherlands, the girls' parents were growing frantic. Kris and Lee were incredibly disciplined about sending daily text messages to let their families know they were safe. But on April 1st, the messages completely stopped. On April 2nd, the Panamanian authorities were officially notified that 2 European tourists had vanished. The local police launched an immediate search. Foot patrols, local guides, and search dogs scoured the El Pianista Trail. They walked up to the summit and searched the immediate pathways, but they found absolutely no trace of the girls. On April 3rd, the search was escalated to include helicopters, which flew low over the thick green canopy, looking for any smoke from a campfire or brightly colored clothing. But the jungle was too dense. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. On April 6th, the frantic parents of Kris and Lee arrived in Panama, accompanied by professional Dutch search and rescue teams and highly trained tracking dogs. The parents immediately announced a massive $30,000 reward for any information that would lead to the discovery of their daughters. To put this in perspective, $30,000 is an astronomical sum of money in rural Panama. For the local population, many of whom were day laborers working on coffee plantations for less than $10 a day, $30,000 was enough to buy a house, purchase land, and completely change their families' lives forever. The parents hoped this massive financial incentive would motivate every single person in the region to search the jungle. But despite the money, despite the massive search parties, and despite the tracking dogs, weeks turned into months, and not a single clue emerged. Kris and Lee had completely vanished into the green abyss. It was not until mid-June, nearly 3 months after the girls went missing, that the first piece of evidence was found. A local woman from a remote village was walking along the banks of a wild, rushing river deep in the jungle about 5 miles away from the El Pianista Trail. As she walked, her eyes caught something blue wedged between some rocks near the water's edge. She climbed down and pulled it out. It was a blue backpack. It was Lisanne's backpack. The woman immediately turned the backpack over to the authorities, and when investigators opened it, they were completely stunned by its condition. The backpack had been floating in a wet, muddy, tropical jungle for nearly 80 days. Yet, the bag was remarkably clean and dry. It was not covered in mold, it had not been torn by wild animals, and everything inside was perfectly, neatly organized. Inside the bag, investigators found 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash, Lee's passport, a water bottle, 2 pairs of neatly folded bras, both of the girls' cell phones, and their digital camera. The pristine, organized condition of the backpack immediately raised massive red flags for investigators. It did not look like a bag that had been dropped by 2 panicked, lost girls fighting for survival in a wild jungle. It looked like it had been carefully packed, preserved, and deliberately placed on the riverbank to be found. With this new discovery, search teams focused their efforts on the area around the river where the backpack was found. A few days later, they made another chilling discovery. Along the banks of the same river, investigators found two pairs of denim shorts. The shorts were neatly folded and placed on top of a rock high above the waterline. One pair belonged to Kris and the other to Lee. Again, the neat, orderly placement of the clothing seemed to suggest that someone had deliberately staged the scene. In August, nearly 5 months after the disappearance, the search teams finally located physical remains. Scattered along the forest floor near the river, investigators found several small bone fragments. They found a pelvic bone, a femur, and a single hiking boot with a human foot still inside it. DNA testing was quickly conducted, and the results confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to Kremers and Lisanne, but when forensic scientists examined the bones, they discovered a series of highly bizarre and terrifying details that completely shattered the simple narrative that the girls had merely gotten lost and died of exposure. First, the bone fragments were found in a state of extreme decomposition, which was normal for the jungle, but Kris's bones were remarkably white. They appeared to have been chemically bleached. There was no biological explanation for why her bones would be completely white and devoid of organic material, while Lee's bones still had tissue attached to them, unless someone had intentionally used bleach or acid to destroy the evidence. Second, there were absolutely no scratch marks or bite marks on any of the bones. This was a crucial finding. If the girls had died in the jungle and their bodies had been torn apart and scattered by wild animals, the bones would have been covered in deep scratches from teeth and claws. The complete absence of these marks meant that the bodies had been dismembered by some other artificial means. Third, and most terrifyingly, mixed in with the small pile of bone fragments belonging to Kris and Lee, were the bone fragments of at least 3 other completely unrelated individuals. This meant that this specific area of the jungle was a dumping ground for multiple bodies. To try to piece together the final days of the girls' lives, forensic experts began analyzing the data on the 2 cell phones and the digital camera found inside the backpack. What they found was a terrifying timeline of events. The data from Kris's iPhone and Lee's Samsung phone showed that on April 1st, the day of their hike, the girls reached the summit of El Pianista around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But just 2 hours later, at 3:48 p.m., the first distress call was placed from one of the phones to the international emergency number 112. Just 12 minutes later, a second distress call was placed from the other phone. Neither of the calls went through because there was absolutely no cell service in that deep ravine. Whatever happened to these girls, it did not happen days into their hike. It happened almost immediately, within 2 hours of them reaching the overlook. Over the next several days, a total of 77 separate emergency calls were placed from both phones. By April 3rd, Lee's Samsung phone had completely died, leaving only Kris's iPhone active. Kris, or whoever had the phone, began turning the iPhone on, waiting for a minute to see if it would pick up a signal, and then turning it off to preserve the battery. But on April 6th, something highly suspicious occurred. Someone turned on Kris's iPhone, but instead of dialing the emergency number, they attempted to log into the phone. They entered the wrong PIN code. They tried again and again, but failed. Between April 6th and April 11th, there were multiple attempts to access the iPhone, but every single attempt was made without entering the correct PIN code. The phone eventually locked completely, preventing anyone from seeing its contents. This raises a massive haunting question. If Kris was still alive and trying to use her phone, why would she suddenly forget her own PIN code? And if she was injured, why wouldn't she tell her best friend, Lee, what the code was? The failed login attempts strongly suggest that a third party, someone who did not know the PIN code, had taken possession of the phone and was trying to hack into it. On April 11th, the iPhone was turned on one last time, left active for an hour, and then the battery died forever. Next, investigators turned their attention to the digital camera. The first series of photos on the camera roll showed a beautiful, happy day. The girls are smiling, posing on the rocks, and enjoying the sun, but then there is a massive gap. No photos were taken for a week. Suddenly, in the early morning hours of April 8th, between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, the camera was used to take over 90 photos in rapid succession. These photos, which have since been leaked to the internet, are some of the most deeply unsettling images you will ever see. All 90-plus photos were taken in pitch-black darkness, deep within the jungle, during a torrential rainstorm. The vast majority of the photos show absolutely nothing but blackness, punctuated by the camera's flash reflecting off raindrops or leaves. But a few of the photos show specific disturbing details. One photo shows a close-up of a rock, on top of which is a twig with pieces of red plastic bag tied to it, looking like a makeshift trail marker. Another photo shows a piece of toilet paper or candy wrapper sitting on a rock. Another photo shows a dark, deep ravine looking down into a rocky abyss. But the most chilling photo of all is a close-up shot of the back of Kremers' head. The photo is taken from behind, showing her distinctive strawberry blonde hair. In the photo, her hair appears to be damp, and there is a visible dark patch on the side of her head that appears to be dried blood, suggesting she had suffered a severe head injury. Why were these photos taken? Some believe the girls were lost in the dark and were using the camera's flash as a makeshift flashlight to see where they were going or to scare off wild animals. Others believe they were trying to signal a rescue helicopter that might have been flying nearby in the dark. But then, forensic experts discovered the most damning piece of digital evidence of all. When they analyzed the camera's memory card, they noticed that the photos were numbered sequentially. Every photo had a specific file number, like 507, 508, 510. But photo number 509 was completely missing. It had been deleted from the camera. Now, if you delete a photo on a digital camera, the camera's software simply marks that space as empty, but the raw data remains on the memory card. A professional forensic technician can easily plug the card into a computer and recover the deleted image. But when the investigators tried to recover photo 509, they found that the data had been completely, professionally wiped. In order to permanently erase a single image so thoroughly that professional forensic software cannot find a single ghost trace of it, the camera would have had to be plugged into a computer, and a specific data wiping software would have had to be run on that specific file. There is absolutely no way two lost, starving girls, sitting in a dark ravine in the middle of a tropical rainstorm, could have connected their digital camera to a computer and professionally wiped photo 509. This means, with absolute certainty, that a third party was in possession of that camera. Someone who had access to a computer, someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and someone who was desperate to destroy whatever evidence was captured in photo 509. The official ruling by the Panamanian government was that Kris and Lee simply got lost on the trail, fell down a steep ravine into the river, and died of exposure and injuries, and that their bodies were naturally washed downstream and decomposed. But this official explanation is completely unsatisfactory to anyone who has looked closely at the evidence. How did two girls who had no heavy gear and no flashlights manage to travel over 5 miles through some of the most dense, mountainous, and treacherous jungle terrain in the world, a distance that even trained military personnel would struggle to cover in a week? Why were their clothes neatly folded and placed on a rock? Why was their backpack completely dry, clean, and neatly organized after 80 days in a swampy jungle? Why did someone try to log into Kris's phone with the wrong PIN code 77 times? Why were Kris's bones chemically bleached, while Lee's were not? And why were their remains mixed in with the bones of 3 other people? The evidence points to a far more sinister reality. It is highly likely that Kris and Lee were targeted, stalked, and abducted. Shortly after they reached the Overlook on April 1st, they were held captive deep in the jungle, where they were eventually murdered. The killer, realizing that the international search was bringing too much heat to the area, decided to stage the scene. They packed the girls' belongings into the blue backpack, wiped the camera's memory card of the incriminating photo 509, and placed the bag and the folded clothes along the riverbank to make it look like an accident. They then dismembered the bodies and scattered the remains, hoping the jungle would destroy the rest of the evidence. The mystery of what truly happened to Kris Kremers and Lisanne on the El Pianista Trail remains a dark, open wound. It is a terrifying reminder that sometimes, when we venture into the beautiful, wild places of the world, we are not alone. And the monsters we encounter in the dark are far more real than we could ever imagine. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.